We have to start measuring these things. We have to start listening to people's concern and making visible the invisible.
I'm going to quote Eileen McNeely back to Eileen McNeely. You spoke about a caring culture at work being 6 times more associated with performance than someone's workload. Why is that? What makes that happen?
So it's really a serendipitous finding because in many things that we do in academic disciplines, in health, we try and get to the root of the problem. So just by nature of trying to understand something, we reduce it to its smallest parts. So when we were looking at the impact of work on human flourishing, we were trying to define the quality in the jobs, how much the workload was, how much autonomy someone had over the control and decisions of their job, what kind of management support and coworker support.
And there are things I've heard listed before that people value, and even things that people would forego a pay rise to have more dignity at work, more autonomy, better control over their schedule, those sorts of things.
What was so interesting is those things were more impactful than workload. And then we thought, we're not focusing on those aspects of the culture that we as humans need for dignity. And honestly, that would be a really important lever.
A caring culture. Meet over half of the working world. They are the machine that powers our society, from making your coffee and emptying your garbage to caring for your relatives and delivering your parcels. You might see them as frontline or essential workers, or you might not see them at all. The Invisible Worker podcast explores the financial landscape of our most diligent workforce. We speak to experts in mobility, inclusion, policy, research, and more to find out where the problems are and how we can start to fix them. My name is Emily, and I host the Invisible Worker podcast, brought to you by Stream, the world's leading financial well-being provider. I'm joined today by Dr. Eileen McNeely, Executive Director and founder of the Harvard Shine program. Eileen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
We are talking about flourishing today and flourishing in the workplace. And you've been studying the invisible worker for decades now, I'd like to say. But you didn't start out that way. You started out with a career in healthcare. And then on a trip to Appalachia to work in a mining community, you had a bit of an epiphany. Can you tell me that story?
Sure, it changed my life. I was working as a community nurse practitioner in Appalachia, and the major industries were coal mining, steel workers. It was also a time when these industries were collapsing, a time when we were starting to do things that were fair compensation for workers. And in particular, in the United States, they passed the black lung disease compensation. And so coal workers who had contracted the disease as part of their work would get compensated.
Okay.
And so I would see the workers in clinic, and we would do x-rays and we would talk about their lives and their health. And they taught me that despite the fact that they lost a father or their uncle had lung disease, they wouldn't do anything different in their lives because they felt so connected to the people around them, and that literally their coworkers had their backs on the job and off the job. And that's when I began to realize that work is so much bigger than these physical hazards. There's also this sense of belonging and connection and purpose and identity.
So even in this dangerous work that was potentially risking their lives, and in some cases was killing workers, they still loved that work and loved the fulfillment and the sense of community they got from it.
Absolutely. And this is where they learn to see others outside of themselves and a higher purpose. And they told me that on the job, they felt so respected. Then they would spend the weekends with their coworkers' families and have dinners and barbecues, and it was their life.
Yeah, a real community.
And it wasn't this thing that we think about now. It's like the separation between work and life. And sometimes we try and make some boundary. But honestly, between our relationships at work and our meaning and identity, it's really hard to say there's a boundary and where to draw the line.
It's increasingly hard, especially in such an interconnected world. It's hard to switch off. But also from that experience working with these minors, you developed a research career and you've begun to deeply understand the ways that your work life and your home life are interconnected and how they influence each other.
So I did start my career with that experience because I was taught in this medical system where physical well-being or physical health was to disease or disability,
Right.
or the prevention of disease and disability. And what I understood is that it's much bigger than that. It's the social arrangements and where we live and we work, and that is as important an aspect of our emotional and social well-being as physical health. And so I left Appalachia and came back to do my degree in policy to see about the economic consequences, the political consequences of systems that influence how we live and work.
What I really like about your work and the way that you frame it is you see well-being as an outcome of work. So not just something where you need to minimize harm or prevent risk, but that actually work should be nourishing in all senses. And in fact, you use the word flourishing. Can you talk to me a little bit about the concept of flourishing?
Yeah, so flourishing is this comprehensive sense of who we are, or arguably what we aim to get or be in life. And so we use 5 dimensions to explain flourishing. So it is physical health and mental health, but it's also social connection and belonging. It's meaning and purpose in life. It's life satisfaction and happiness. It's character and virtue, but it's also financial well-being as drivers to those outcomes. And lastly, I would say about flourishing is we get so much of that from work. It's our forever university. Once we go through our secondary or college education, or even other kinds of education for our career, it fortifies us because of the connections that we make, because of the skills that we learn, because we have an opportunity for agency and creativity and learning. It helps us flourish.
I also know that there's some prior research that looks at the impact of feeling fulfilled at work. So when you find your job fulfilling, you have really significant uplift in health outcomes and health behaviors as well. So you're much more likely to follow health and safety instructions, or you are more likely to look after yourself, so to eat well and get enough sleep, and it impacts your long-term cardiovascular health and your longevity and even your quality of life. So this idea of feeling fulfilled at work and finding purpose can be more beneficial to your health than some of the other things we think of as being really, really important to health. I think that's super interesting and not as well understood. So in your world, you're looking at how do you measure that and how do you design work so that it is fulfilling and so that it does help people to flourish. And when we met earlier this year at a conference, you presented some data and there were some really interesting things. So I'm going to quote Eileen McNeely back to Eileen McNeely, and I'd love for you to expand on this. But you spoke about a caring culture at work being 6 times more associated with performance than someone's workload. Why is that? What makes that happen?
So it's really a kind of serendipitous finding, because in many things that we do in academic disciplines, in health, we try and get to the root of the problem. So just by nature of trying to understand something, we reduce it to its smallest parts. So when we were looking at the impact of work on human flourishing, we were trying to define the quality in the jobs, how much the workload was, how much autonomy someone had over the control and decisions of their job, what kind of management support and coworker support.
And there are things I've heard listed before that people value, and even things that people would forego a pay rise to have more dignity at work, more autonomy, better control over their schedule, those sorts of things.
Yeah, so we were focusing on men, but we thought there is this kind of ambient environment that everyone's exposed to, no matter what job you do in this place. And so we started asking the questions about human dignity. Do people feel that they trust management, that they feel safe and cared for, that they feel things are fair and just? And we actually asked questions about the ambient culture.
Yeah.
And what was so interesting is those things were more impactful than workload. And then we thought, we're not focusing on those aspects of the culture that we as humans need for dignity. And honestly, that would be a really important lever.
A caring culture.
Hmm.
And it plays out in so many interesting ways. And in my day job at Stream, one of the things that we do is we implement workplace savings. So making it much, much easier to save a portion of your pay. And what we see through that is people rate their employers really highly as caring because they value that. They value something that's thoughtful and designed for them and their lives and their wants and their needs, much more than maybe other workplace benefits or programs. So it's showing that you've seen and heard what people want and what they need, and acting on that creates this feeling of a caring culture.
I would imagine so. And what really helps too is there's benefits in the background or things that employers really want to do, but making that explicit and part of the social compact of work so that everyone can really understand what they're aiming for together.
Talk to me a little bit about taking a systems approach when it comes to the workplace. So, how you measure all these different components of the system and how they influence well-being and flourishing.
So a lot of employers take engagement scores or job satisfaction scores. And while those are interesting for the business to prevent turnover and to attract talent, the other part of it is there's something that's driving those things. And unless we look at those structures across the system of work, and more than just material processes and flows, it's the human experience. We're never going to solve job satisfaction and engagement. So the systems level is really requires worker voice about their work experience, not just the outcome that so you're looking at the whole ecosystem of work.
So, not just a score on an engagement survey, but actually a description of why they gave that score or what's going on or what drove them to feel positive or negative about their experience of work.
Correct. And I'll give you just one quick example.
Yes, please.
When we were looking at factory workers across the garment supply chain, and we had different kinds of elements of their work that were standardized to ask about. We didn't know to ask about their access to finances. And once we asked, we understood. And so worker voice is so important to just beyond standardized surveys.
Yes. And I want you to talk about Shine more broadly, and particularly, you say what is invisible cannot be managed, right? So if you don't see it, if you don't know to ask, if you don't understand it, you can't change it, you can't measure it, you can't see how it's working. So I'd love it if you could take a few moments to describe the Shine program at Harvard. And then I'm going to ask you a few additional questions about some of the research you've done over the years.
Sure. So I love this idea of you only really care about something once you measure it. And so looking at all those elements of the work system explicitly and putting them up on a dashboard allows the conversation and the ability to change things that aren't working. But when we went into the factories, to go back to that example again, what we didn't realize is that when workflows have not been managed correctly or orders were not placed, then the backload on workers and the overtime hours were really hard. And that was something that they had no control over.
Yeah.
So that's a lever that unless you measured that in conjunction with their experience, you wouldn't know what's upstream.
Got it. And actually, a sense of control is something that came out in your research as being really important. And I find this fascinating. So in the pandemic, what you found was that a sense of control was a bigger lever for financial stress than financial fragility, as in someone's subjective feelings about how much they could manage their money mattered more than their objective financial situation. What is it about control?
I think this is a really important question, and it actually leads to a lot of opportunities for more research on this issue because we used to just measure income and we used to measure expenses and budget, but it's people's sense of hope and optimism and control over their lives and their budget that makes a really important difference. And we weren't looking for that before. And then the pandemic, it was a really hard time, but it was possible in that shadow.
And the pandemic created some really interesting conditions for research as well. One of the other pieces that you've looked at with your team is the impact of limited social interaction on shift workers. So people working not your normal 9 to 5, so they don't have that social overlap. And also in the pandemic, people were kept apart from their colleagues, right? There was a physical safety risk. And you found that this impact was heightened on shift workers compared to other parts of the working population. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
So, one of the things I would say as the takeaway message, we were trying to understand, are workers who are flourishing do better at work? Or does work become a platform for flourishing? What comes first?
Right, chicken and the egg problem.
Right. And very often we don't know this answer because we don't have what we call longitudinal data over time.
Yeah.
But we did. And what we were seeing was, yes, there's a lot of things that we bring to work that help us flourish, but there's things that come from work uniquely. And it might be just in this time where usual institutions of social connection and belonging are breaking down in terms of people going to church on Sunday or families migrating or whatever. But you get more of your social community and connection from work than anywhere else. And whether that's in person or remotely or in a hybrid situation, people really need that. And so, how do we aim for that intentionally and understand that work is a great source of community that we need more than ever now?
We do. And on the other side of that equation, and maybe I'm linking things up incorrectly, you can tell me if I'm wrong here. Your research also found that distraction at work was 15 times more costly than absenteeism. So, what is the connection between that social and that community and that distraction piece? So, how do you have a good outcome for people, but also a good outcome for business?
Yes, distraction is a really big problem. We don't usually measure it. It's the invisible thing.
Yeah.
Yes. And we actually started inventorying that and to try and understand what are the drivers of that.
Yeah.
And part of that is about social connection and meaning and purpose. But part of it also is what we call attention economy,
Yeah.
where people are just overwhelmed with information that's flowing 24/7, global time zones. It's nonstop. So what do people pay attention to? And it's complex information. It's dynamic. It's ever changing.
Yeah. I've found myself needing to delete things from my phone. I found my phone a distraction at work. And I feel like I'm a parent, so my phone has to be on because I have young kids and I need to be contactable. And so I deleted social media and then I deleted LinkedIn and then I deleted something else. And I got to the point where I was at work, working, checking my work email on my phone and I'm trying to understand what is driving me to distract myself with this. What is the need that's being met and how do I stop it? Do you have any hot tips for me to fix my distraction at work problem?
Maybe we can learn from our educational system, which a lot of the schools, especially the primary and secondary schools here in the US, are having phone policies just to limit screen time so that we get a break. We also have some great research showing that screen time is actually very disturbing to our neurological and adrenal system. And so figuring out how to minimize distraction
Yeah.
is a really big conundrum. And it really depends on two things. One is rituals, and that we are accustomed to looking at our screen. But
Yeah.
the other thing is having rituals to have downtime, off time, whatever. And then now we can use AI to actually turn things over to an agent. And it's not to dehumanize us, it's actually to help us in this very complex economy.
It's a very challenging environment. I
Mm.
actually thought to myself, maybe I need to get a desk phone, like a landline. Go back to how it was in my 20s with my desk and put my cell phone away. Maybe that's my answer. Eileen, I want to come back to the Harvard Flourishing Index. We spoke about that briefly before. So that's the 5 areas: happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, close social relationships. And as you were saying, it's underpinned by financial and material security.
Mm-hmm.
So financial and material security alone don't create flourishing or happiness, but they are a requirement for everything else to flow from. What happens when they are lacking?
So it's interesting. We just released the results for the Global Flourishing Study, and that's in across 22 countries.
Yeah.
And we were looking at indexing all those aspects, including financial. And we learned a couple of things. One was that things are tougher financially in the global south. And maybe that's not a new finding for a lot of people. But what was interesting is some of the places where financial well-being was highest also suffered from loneliness and meaning and purpose in life and social connection in particular. And it was very interesting to see India has the strongest social belonging and connection than any country in the world. And so you say, okay, now how does this work when they ranked very low on financial? And so I bring this up because how do you make sense of this? You need to understand everything together. And when I travel to factories around the world, it is in those most vulnerable, financial, fragile situations where people pull together. And that helps in confronting the reality of their lives. It would be better if they had financial security instead of fragility, but they are trying to flourish in other ways that we don't think we take for granted and we need here.
That almost comes back to your miners from the Appalachia region, which is they had something that was quite lacking, which was physical health.
That's a great example. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. The other thing that you've done that I find really fascinating is, and I think I've overused the word fascinating on today's conversation, but there's so much. You actually measured the physical outcomes of financial security and stress using insurance claims. I think it's widely accepted that financial, mental, and physical health are interconnected, but I'm not sure that it was measured robustly in terms of how financial health impacts physical health. I would love you to tell me some of the findings from that.
You know, we were talking about the chicken and the egg problem.
Yeah.
And I think that happens a lot with health and wealth. When people have health problems, it requires more resources. And so you say they go together, that if they have a bad health problem, then they're going to be financially more vulnerable. On the other hand, if someone has financial fragility or insecurity, then they don't have the resources to keep themselves healthy. So we know these things go hand in hand.
Yeah.
What we didn't really see is how does flourishing across all these dimensions, including financial, predict what we always measure here in terms of health, which is physical and mental health.
Yeah.
And we had this great advantage with this data set to look at health claims data through an insurance company. We looked over time, so it's more rigorous data, to see, are people who are flourishing over time, do they have less claims? You have claims when things are not going so well.
Right.
And so, in fact, that was true, that if we could keep people flourishing, we could keep them healthier.
And so again, linking that back to a business case from an employer point of view, focusing on flourishing and well-being as an outcome of work potentially reduces your health costs. as
And
an
that's
employer.
really important because in many countries, in the US in particular, our healthcare is paid for by our employers, mostly during our working lives. And so that is a big return on investment because healthcare, it's close to 19% of the GDP.
It's huge.
Yeah.
I want to drill into a specific example from your research. I want to talk about the Harvard flight attendant study. Before we started recording, you were telling me a few other examples of where you've been measuring financial health and well-being outcomes in the workplace. This is the longest running study on the health and well-being of flight attendants. It's a very understudied population. There's huge physical risks, spending your working life on an airplane, changing time zones, dealing with everything that's in your environment. And it's a predominantly female workforce.
85%-ish.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a little bit less since we started. It's gone down to 82%, but yeah.
But still a very significantly female workforce.
Correct.
Unsurprising that it's then understudied. Tell me what you learned about the flight attendants.
Okay, we'll go back to the uniforms as an example.
Yeah.
There was a number of airlines that when they have new uniforms, it's very rare that 15,000 people wear the same thing on the same day or the same month, and not just for 5 hours, 8 hours, but usually 15 hours by the time you go back forth from the hotel or from your house and take a trip and then go back.
Yeah.
And they were complaining about reactions to the uniforms. And so we did study about chemicals in uniforms, but a number of these flight attendants said they went to their doctors or they went to their managers or they went to their union, said, we're experiencing those things, and they felt ghosted. And that it was in their head, they were told, well, you're just anxious. We started studying this in 2011. And just recently, some of those cases have been won. But it is feeling
lawsuits against the uniform manufacturers.
Exactly. But it's this point of feeling invisible.
Yes.
And that's what we heard from flight attendants, not just for the uniforms, but for other kinds of concerns. Like, just as an example, one of the exposures in flights is cosmic radiation. And women who were pregnant or wanted to be pregnant were concerned. In the UK and Europe, there are guidelines about not having to work during that first trimester.
Yeah.
Not here. There are no protections for flight crew. They're considered radiation workers, but there's no particular dosage or exposure measurement. So it's invisible.
Yeah.
And I love the way that you think about this. We have to start measuring these things. We have to start listening to people's concern and making visible the invisible. And that's what the flight attendant study, I'm really passionate about it because when we do things, we do a lot of quantitative research, but we also hold focus groups and listen to workers. And I learned so much that way.
And you told me that when you started back in the early noughties, you were there with pen and paper in airports, tapping people and asking questions. And that one of the really big moments for people was if a flight was delayed. And I don't think a lot of people listening will understand why that is. Can you go into that in a bit more detail?
Yeah, we were in the hubs, crew rooms.
Yeah.
We would have tables and we'd be collecting paper surveys. I know it sounds really dinosaurish now, but it was also a good way to see things. And so when flights were delayed and came in late, the flight attendants were sobbing sometimes. And when you asked them why, they said, I couldn't contact my children. And my kids have been home alone. You don't even think about being a mother and having responsibilities for caregiving and being caught in a plane.
Yeah.
It's a very unique work setting. we hardly have any other career that's quite like that.
And the other side to that was the cost of that. So if
Mhm.
you were paying for childcare, or if you were hoping to get public transport home, but now it's stopped running, but exacerbating the cost of that was the hours they were being paid for. And this has since changed, but you told me that they only were paid when the plane was in the air.
And this is not true for all airlines now, but for some, I think Delta started it first here, and that was it used to be your hourly pay started when the flight took off, and when the flight touched down, it ended. But we all know, because we've boarded planes,
Yeah.
that the flight attendants are there boarding the planes, and then when the passengers disembark. And it was really crazy to think about that that wasn't accommodated in their pay or considered in equally.
Yeah. I got on a flight once last year, and there was an air traffic strike. So the plane pushed back, and then they announced that there was going to be a 2-hour wait on the runway before we could take off. And when you told me that story, I kept thinking, gosh, imagine if all those people sat on that plane weren't being paid for those 2 hours.
Hmm.
And the passengers were not calm about that wait, right? That is probably the hardest time on a flight, when people are anxious to get going or upset because there's a delay. The air conditioning isn't working because the plane's not up in the sky. Everyone's too hot or too cold. It seems absurd that they're not being paid for it. And you're saying that is still the case in some airlines.
Correct. Correct. Yes.
That's outrageous.
And here's the other thing about making visible the invisible. When the market collapsed in 2008, there was all these mergers of the airlines. And a lot of the airlines had unions. In the mergers, they lost their retirement. They've been working as crew all their life, and they had to lose their retirement. And their pay was already pretty low comparatively. It's something we don't even know about or see.
No. Well, I'm so glad you've come on to tell us about that, because I think it's so important to highlight these things and have these conversations. And credit to Delta for paving the way on changing the way flight attendants are paid. I hope everybody else is following quite quickly. I think this is a nice moment to wrap up on. And as you know, and as we've been discussing, the theme of this podcast is the invisible worker and their financial lives. And I always find people who don't walk in these shoes are quite persistently shocked by some of the differences in their financial lives. And I always ask one closing question. I've got two for you, Eileen. All right. I want you to tell me, what is the one thing you wish other people knew about the financial lives of this invisible worker? And what is the one thing you wish more companies would measure?
So I think about the most vulnerable workers that, in terms of financial, is factory workers in some of the sectors like garment and apparel. And what we don't realize is that their pay comes from every piece that they put together. And so if a company cancels an order, they don't get paid.
Wow.
And I know we've talked about wait staff who get paid really when someone tips them.
Yeah.
And if they don't tip them, they don't get paid. It's piecework. I don't think we realize how many workers are piece workers. And it's interesting because we thought we were changing that. But now with the gig economy, we have to rethink that, because there's more workers that are as vulnerable and susceptible to this fragility and insecurity of volatility in their financial lives.
They're absorbing the risk, the corporate risk.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. And for my second closing question, you got my bonus question today. What is the one thing you wish more companies would measure? What can we make visible?
Of course, I'm going to say flourishing.
Of course you are.
I think when we just measure engagement or job satisfaction, there is some cynicism at this point when work is tough and people feel that they don't have job security, unlike in the 50s, 60s, 70s, here in the US anyway. What they see is the accounting is for the business, by the business. And it would really, I think, marry the worker and the business if we made visible that work is a platform for flourishing. And we measured that and put it up next to job satisfaction and engagement. I think everyone would know what to aim for.
I love that. And we're going to link to the Harvard Flourishing Index in the show notes, which has a toolkit that you can download and use. So no excuses. You can measure it, right?
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dr. Eileen McNeely.
Thank you.
Before you go, make sure you stay in touch. Please subscribe to the Invisible Worker podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you go to listen. That way you can follow along as we release new episodes. Thanks again, and see you soon.